Hey, in this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Canon 45mm tilt shift lens. For this review, I'm going to show you some test shots I took of my pineapple, who I think should be called Larry from now on, as well as going through my portfolio to show you how I've used it in real world scenarios, because test shots are pretty useless, but I know that some people like to have them anyway, so we'll do both. Now, first of all, let's talk about this lens. It is built like a tank. It is a metal construction as you would need for a tilt shift lens because of the mechanisms within it. Like so. It is manual focus, as are all tilt shift lenses from what I understand. It's pretty decent front element going on, not that I really know much about that, and I've scratched it, which is annoying, but thankfully the scratch has no impact whatsoever on image quality. I actually scratched this one the first time I ever used it, which was particularly galling, and it was on a job that was absolutely horrendous as well, so it was a double whammy of a bad day. Awful job, scratch my new lens, bad times all round. However, this is a brilliant lens for food photographers and wedding photographers. If you want to get that cool tilt shifty large format look in your weddings, it's the 45mm that you want to buy. It is the most versatile. If you're shooting particularly large projects, perhaps interiors, also a great lens. But for food, it's brilliant. Now, if I was an out and out food photographer and that's all I was going to be shooting, I would buy this before the 50mm lens. It is far more versatile, and it will do the same as a 50mm lens anyway. If I'm a bit of a doing this, doing that, bit of portrait, bit of event, get the 50 because the autofocus will save your bacon. Now, there are some drawbacks to this lens. One is that they have these little lock rings here that you sort of tighten and loosen to keep it in position. However, they get stuck all the time. This one's stuck, won't move, but it's not locked at all. There's a new 50mm version of this lens, which is, in terms of image quality, it just destroys this lens. It blows it out of the water. It's so much better. But this is so cheap. You can buy these secondhand, and I'd suggest buying it secondhand. Because there's no autofocus, there's not a great deal that can go wrong. So buy them used, don't buy them brand new. But this is a bargain, absolute bargain. I'll try and find a link to one, I'll pop it in the description below. Let's jump onto the computer and have a look at the pineapple pictures. Okay, so here we are at 2.8. I'd say that the outer focus and bokeh is not as good as the 90mm tilt shift, but it's better than the Sigma Art 50mm lens. However, it's a 2.8, not a 1.4, so there's a few, reasons to perhaps stay away from this lens. The image quality is fine. It's good enough. It's not groundbreaking. It's nothing to write home about, but it gets the job done. At 2.8, that's usable. At f4, it sharpens up considerably. There's a lot more detail. I'd say the colour rendition is nowhere near that of a Zeiss lens, but it's on par with the Sigma Art series. Now, these lenses, I think they were designed in the 80s or 90s. They're pretty old tech, and I'm putting it on a 50 megapixel camera here. Again, it's a bit muddy, struggling with the resolution, I think at 5.6 f8. This is about as good as it's going to get. Now, this is zoomed into 100%. If we just a bit of context here. Here's the pineapple filling the screen. That's how big the actual pineapple is. We're zooming in a long way. Looking at it from this distance here at f8, absolutely brilliant. 5.6 is lovely as well. f4, pretty nice. Now let's just stop down to f20. And it looks awful. Let's wait for it to finish loading, but it doesn't get much better than this. If anything, we should keep it pixelated. Look at this, it's soft. The lens is way past usable. So I think on this lens about f10 is your limit, but you don't need more depth of field than that because we can use the Schimflung principle. We can just bend the front of the lens down a little bit and just increase that depth of field. So let's jump into my website and talk about how we use this lens. So let's jump into my website? That's probably a good description of it. Let's jump into my website and have a look at how I use this lens. So this was shot with the lens, so I keep browsing around this because it changes location all the time. This was also shot with the lens. Depending on the size of the monitor I have depends on where my images end up. It's really confusing. Now I shot this in a really small studio where we couldn't get a lens high enough up. So to get this shot in, I had to use the 45mm lens and the shift function to make a panoramic to get it all in. And these were used in print, on web. It's a really useful lens in that sort of context. This was also shot with a lens. This time just straight down using the manual focus. I was originally going to stack the image and make a panoramic, but I ended up deciding not to. Absolutely fine. Absolutely, there's no reason not to use it. Now, where it would have been useful, and this image wasn't shot with that lens, This was shot with a 35mm lens to get the whole shot in, and we lost a lot of detail and a lot of resolution in terms of like how much resolution each item takes up in real estate. If I'd have shot this with a 45mm lens, I could have taken one picture here, swung it along, got another picture here, and then another shift and got the third picture and stitched them together. It would have given me far higher image quality and a much better image for those sorts of big, busy flat lays. The workaround for that is this image here where we've used a 80 megapixel phase 1. When you print this big, it looks gorgeous. All the detail's still there. Whereas here, we lost a lot of it along the way. Now, I don't have a great deal of stuff to show you from this lens because the work I do with it predominantly, not that interesting. Pays the bills, but not that interesting. The first day I shot with it, when I scratched it, we were shooting stuff for cutouts. And it's just the ultimate tool in terms of, you see a packet of something and it has one of the items cut out on the front of it. Those tiny items, getting them all in focus, unless you want a focus stack, which is a real pain in post. This is the lens to achieve that look. Now, I've not used it for portraits, not for any particular reason. It's just I very rarely shoot with a 50mm lens for a portrait. Maybe I'll give it a go in my next workshop. But I think it's a great lens and it's a good purchase. If you are going to be a food photographer, buy this lens before you buy a 50. But I do think that in the long run you will need both of those lenses because sometimes you want that dreamy 1.4, 1.2 f1 look. Other times you need the technicalities of the tilt shift lens to be able to achieve the shot you want. The other use for this is landscapes. Now, although you're probably thinking you want something a bit wider for a landscape, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. The joys of a 45 is, if you take the 3 shots going one here, one there, and one at the end, when you stitch those together, you'll get a 24mm field of view and a huge file to play with. So if you're into the big resolution and making the big prints, it's a great way to do it without burning into medium format money. I hope you enjoyed this review. Do hit subscribe if you want to have more gear reviews, more practical advice on how to take certain shots, and also business advice in the photography world. I'll see you all next time.